Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/WTech. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washington Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
Tech and telecom policies make it into Congress's new spending bill. Pandora is going to have to pay more to record labels. And Davina Sashkin joins me. The $1.1 trillion omnibus spending bill Congress passed last week to keep the government going through next fall contains a number of technology-related provisions. First, apparently prompted by Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email account during her tenure as Secretary of State, the spending bill contains a rider that would withhold $10 million in funding from the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, if they fail to meet transparency requirements around their policies for employees' use of personal email accounts. The spending bill also passed without provisions that conservative members advocated for, which would have prevented the net neutrality rules from being implemented. The spending bill also blocks funding that would help transition the U.S. federal government's control of the Internet domain naming system for another year, according to The Hill, another power shift Republicans do not want. And remember the rules the FCC passed regarding joint sales agreements, or JSAs, the agreements under which broadcast station owners can circumvent the FCC's broadcast ownership rules by taking over ad sales functions of other stations in the same market. The FCC's JSA rules set the percentage of ad sales that can be sold under these agreements to 15% of the airtime of the other station. At that point, the station owner selling the airtime of the other station is deemed to have an ownership stake in the other station. Well, despite resistance from some members, including Anna Eshoo, about the impact diluting these rules would have on media ownership diversity, the omnibus spending bill that passed last week actually prevents the rules from being applied to JSAs that existed prior to when the FCC passed the rules back in March of 2014. Congress has also delayed conducting any hearings on media ownership diversity. The one scheduled back in September was canceled after John Boehner announced his resignation from the House. No new hearing has been slated since. The spending bill also extended a ban on state and local taxation on monthly internet bills, the Internet Tax Freedom Act. Some states, including Texas, stand to lose hundreds of millions of dollars in state tax revenues if the ban becomes permanent, which is expected. Separately, Zoe Lofgren, the Democrat from California, and Republican Representative from Arizona Trent Franks reintroduced the Wireless Tax Fairness Act last week, which would place a 5-year moratorium on new state and local taxes on wireless service. Some of those taxes are as high as 36%, which is the rate in Chicago. CTIA VP Jot Carpenter wrote that the taxes are, quote, discriminatory because the rates are far higher than applicable sales taxes, which in Chicago, for example, are currently 9.25%. The FCC held its December meeting Thursday, its final open meeting of the year. The agency ruled to eliminate several dated telecom rules and to streamline some satellite licensing rules. But FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler also announced the agency has written to AT&T, Comcast, and T-Mobile inquiring about their video programming services that don't count against data caps, so-called zero rating services. Comcast's Stream TV, AT&T's Data Perks and Sponsored Data, and T-Mobile's Binge On all offer movies and other video programming on a separate cable channel rather than over the internet. The Copyright Royalty Board raised the rate Pandora is going to have to pay per 100 songs played on the music streaming service. Currently, the rate is 14 cents per 100 songs played on streams by users who haven't signed up for paid subscriptions. That rate is going up to 17 cents per 100 plays streamed, while the rate for plays on the subscription service of Pandora is going down to 22 cents per 100 songs played. For an overview of how copyright policy works, check out Casey Ray, Executive Director of the Future of Music Coalition, on Washington Tech Policy Podcast, episode number 9. The Senate unanimously approved a bill last Monday that would protect consumers' ability to post negative consumer reviews on websites like Yelp. If the bill passes the House, it would prevent online companies from including such gag clauses in their user agreements and delegate enforcement authority to the Federal Trade Commission and the states. The Hill notes that the House has a similar bill which would grant enforcement authority to the Department of Justice. Google reported a 45% uptick in the number of persons named in government data requests, but that data requests overall were down 4% last year. The House approved a bill called the Combat Terrorist Use of Social Media last week, which would require the White House to work more closely with social media companies to prevent terrorists from using social media to carry out attacks. The FCC ordered last week that it would exempt smaller internet service providers from net neutrality provisions that require ISPs to be transparent about their pricing policies. The FCC wants to evaluate more about how these transparency provisions will affect ownership diversity. Finally, President Obama renominated Federal Trade Commission Chair Edith Ramirez to chair the agency. One seat on the 5-member agency still remains open. For you, my dear listeners of the Washington Tech Policy Podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a 30-day free trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. Why not listen at the gym, in the car, or on your morning run? How about The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, the Japanese Art of Decluttering and Organizing by Marie Kondo and Emily Lou Zeller? You can download The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up or another audiobook free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at audibletrial.com/WTech. My guest today is Davina Sashkin, who is a member of the law firm of Fletcher, and Hildreth. Ms. Sashkin counsels clients on television and radio broadcast regulation and compliance, broadband internet and triple play regulations, spectrum auctions, and commercial transactions among FCC-regulated businesses. Prior to joining the firm in 2008, Ms. Sashkin was an associate with the law firm Irwin, Campbell, and Tannenwald. Ms. Sashkin is a graduate of the Catholic University of America Columbus School of Law, where she earned a certificate in communications law studies. Prior to law school, Ms. Sashkin worked in the field of corporate communications. She also holds a Master's of Arts in Communication, Culture, and Technology from Georgetown and a Bachelor of Arts from the George Washington University. While in law school, Ms. Sashkin served as editor-in-chief of the ComLaw Conspectus, Journal of Communications, Law, and Policy. She is the author of Failure of Imagination: Why Inaction on Net Neutrality Regulation Will Result in a De facto Legal Regime Promoting Discrimination and Consumer Harm. Ms. Sashkin also interned at the Federal Communications Commission and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the Department of Commerce. Ms. Sashkin is admitted to practice law in the Commonwealth of Virginia and before the Supreme Court of the United States and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She is an active member of the Federal Communications Bar Association, serving for nearly a decade on the Charity Auction Committee and as co-chair on many other committees, including Mass Media and Enforcement. Please welcome Davina Sashkin. Davina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So we keep hearing about the incentive auctions, but can you tell us a little bit more about what the incentive auctions are and the problem they're trying to address?
Well, the incentive auction is really an unprecedented undertaking by the federal government. Congress in 2012 decided that it was a better use of spectrum to reclaim certain swaths of spectrum dedicated to broadcast television and repackage that and sell it to wireless providers because there is more and more demand for high capacity and so-called beachfront wireless spectrum for all of our high data usage that everything is moving toward. So in 2012, the Spectrum Act was adopted. The FCC was given the task of reclaiming from broadcast licensees their spectrum on a voluntary basis and then reselling it, if you will, to wireless providers. And then the money that comes from the wireless providers and that what's called the forward auction would go to pay the broadcasters who relinquish their spectrum in what's called the reverse auction. There's a third component that is also unique in that while it has happened before that the FCC has reallocated spectrum bands. We saw that with what was called the DTV transition, our transition to digital television approximately 10 years ago, and that the FCC required television stations to go digital but didn't have any funds available for them to recover some of that cost. In this instance, the television spectrum band, basically the channels that are allocated for television broadcast use, will be repackaged down to a smaller swath of a band. So those stations that remain broadcast stations after the auction will be what's called repacked into that smaller swath. They'll be changing channels and likely changing facilities. This time, Congress allocated a fund called the Broadcast Relocation Fund to pay the expenses for broadcasters. So there's going to be a repacking process after the auction to basically just move everybody around. So it's a major undertaking, and it's really never been done before in the world. So we're an interesting test case. Hopefully it will go well.
So it has three parts: the reverse auction, which is broadcast spectrum sold back to the FCC.
That's correct.
The forward auction, which is the repackaged spectrum sold to wireless bidders. Mm-hmm. And then repacking, the reallocation of the remaining TV stations onto the smaller band.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, so how will this affect consumers? Why should consumers be concerned about how the incentive auction process works?
Well, from a broadcast perspective, consumers should be concerned about the possibility that they will lose some of their favorite programming and their outlets in their community. You may have seen in both the New York Times recently, I think just this past weekend, and Washington Post articles before that, that WHUT in Washington, D.C., which is the only African-American owned public television station in the United States, it's actually owned by Howard University, it is considering putting its station in the auction. And that's largely because the prices that are being bandied about for the potential proceeds from the auction for relinquishment of spectrum is astronomical and could never be achieved in just a normal market rate sale of a station. So, here you are with a lot of universities and public broadcasters in particular, and maybe some smaller broadcasters in small markets, religious stations, and community-based stations that are looking at this and have to ask themselves, do we pass up on this perhaps once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to monetize our spectrum? Yes, it means that we may not be able to be on the air, but think of all the things that we can do with that money. And of course, now there are other options for getting programming out there. I mean, there's so much what they call OTT, over the top avenues, which is basically internet delivered programming, that some programmers are having to really have a good deep think about it. Let's put it that way. But consumers will certainly be affected because they will lose some programming. There's no doubt about that.
So you're saying that the competition from over-the-top providers like Netflix and Hulu are making broadcasters consider, well, maybe it's becoming too competitive anyway, so I should just go ahead and sell my station.
I mean, that's part of it. I mean, certainly they're sort of to look at it in the long run and see what their long-term goal is and what the long-term plan is. For smaller stations that are owned perhaps by a family or a very small group of people, closely held companies, or even sole proprietorships. Not every television station in the country is owned by the big four networks. A lot are owned by small groups in small communities. They have to look at this in a long-term proposition. Maybe if it's a sole proprietorship and they don't have, maybe a son or daughter that wants to take on the family business, so to speak, maybe it's the time to cash out. Maybe they have to look at it that way. Maybe, on the other hand, they could look at it, I think, as what's been reported about WHUT. They're looking at it as maybe an opportunity. You could still you could utilize the new avenues they're presented by over-the-top internet-based delivery of video programming, like a Netflix or Hulu or all the other competitors are coming out there. So you could still provide some sort of video service just on a different platform, but also still realize all of that money that you probably would never have another opportunity to see, and put that to other uses at the university. So, from that perspective, there's two sides to, every story, and it's just going to be interesting how that plays out. I know there probably will be a lot of public comment and concern about certain stations potentially being lost, but that may just be where we are in the market, and so we're seeing what the long-term future is of television.
So now, Davina, you're a partner at Fletcher, and Hildreth, one of the top communications firms in Washington, if not the world. Who are the clients that your firm tends to advise, and what are some of the issues around the incentive auctions that you think they ought to be aware of or concerned about that you haven't mentioned already?
Well, our firm is a top to bottom communications firm, and we advise clients on all aspects, and that actually can sometimes put us in a little bit of a bind, but we try to be as open and available to our clients as possible on all sorts of matters. We have clients that are broadcasters, of course, so larger broadcasters that are network affiliates, all the way down to what's called Class A television stations and low power television stations, often which are providing niche market broadcasting to minority groups or to minority audiences, or religious programming. We advise them as far as the auction. We also have a number of wireless clients who, of course, are interested in the forward side of the auction and how to best be able to participate in that. And also to make sure that they are eligible for as many bidding credits and special provisions like rural provider provisions as possible. Thirdly, we also have a practice which represents wireless microphone equipment manufacturers, some of the white space equipment device manufacturers and sellers. So, and they are interested in the spectrum auction situation because with the repacked television spectrum, they are looking at losing what we call white spaces, which are currently the quote unquote spaces between television channels, which are there in order to eliminate interference between television channels, but allow all manner of unlicensed spectrum-using devices to operate, such as your Wi-Fi router in your house and your baby monitor and your car door remote control. All of those things use white spaces, and wireless microphones have historically had a dedicated channel to use in the television band that's sort of set aside for them. And there's a big debate about how to go about allocating this new band so that everybody can still participate and no one is squeezed out. As you can imagine, that's a major fight, and it's to be decided. We provide advice to all these disparate groups, and this auction is certainly a challenge for our clients, but it's very interesting and intriguing and hopefully can work out well for everyone. I mean, there's opportunities to be had for each of these different groups of clients.
That's actually a good segue because you're talking about basically trying to take all the spectrum and compress it down. I don't know how much they want to compress it, but it's kind of a perfect segue to get into some of the mechanics of how the incentive auctions are going to work. And one of those things, the major thing is the price. And So who determines how much stations are going to charge once they sell their spectrum back to the FCC?
Well, it's interesting because in normal auctions, when you and I think of an auction, you typically start at a low price and you bid up. What's interesting about this auction is the reverse auction portion of the spectrum auction or incentive auction is the true incentive part of the auction. The money that is being offered to broadcasters is to incentivize them to voluntarily relinquish their spectrum so that it can be repurposed for wireless use. So what will happen is it's a reverse auction, so prices start high and go down. The reason for this is that the FCC didn't want to be in a position of having to just determine the market rate for stations all across the country, because you can imagine the kind of litigation that would have generated. Because every station is going to say, whoa, no, I'm worth way more than that. So that would never have worked. As much as there's been a lot of gnashing of teeth about the reverse auction, I think it is probably the best way to reach what would be the actual market value of stations. What will happen is each station will be given and has been given an opening bid. It's been published by the FCC, and it's based on a formula that they've worked out with all manner of consultants and auction experts, and you name it. They've had it simulated and worked out algorithms, and half of every order that's come out is a bunch of what looks to me like gobbledygook, but it's a lot of formulas. There's a lot of math in there, and I'm a lawyer. I'm not a mathematician, so I just have to rely on people who know better than I do that it makes sense. But basically, the opening bids start at a very, very ridiculously high number for most stations. For example, the highest price station in the country is, of course, in New York City. And the way that they've determined the opening bid prices and how it will go down is based partly on population count, meaning how many people does that television signal actually cover. And of course, New York City is the most densely populated city in the country. So you can imagine why the top stations are in New York. And then also it has to do with stations that have interference constraints from other stations that can't be resolved through the repack and for other reasons. For example, stations along the borders, and you wouldn't think maybe Toledo, Ohio would be a very hot market, but let me tell you, the FCC is very, very interested in a lot of stations in the Toledo market because of, it's sort of sandwiched in there between Cleveland and Detroit, but also you have Canadian stations to be concerned about, and there's interference constraints there. So the formula is based on population and interference constraints. And so that New York station starts at $900 million. Everybody else goes down from there. Each round of the reverse auction will drop 5% for each station. And at each point, any station could agree to accept that price or drop out entirely. If you accept the price, then the price keeps going down until there are no more stations needed to be cleared out of the market. At each point, because based on these interference constraints, at some point each station in the market will find sort of its resting point, and that would theoretically be its market value point. Go ahead.
Now, Davina, we're seeing conflicting estimates on exactly how much the incentive auctions will raise. We saw one estimate from the FCC and another from, I believe it was the Congressional Budget Office, which has estimated the net proceeds will be around $25 billion. What's your take on some of the estimates we've seen out there?
Well, that doesn't sound outrageous to me. The reason I say that is because, of course, the AWS-3 auction, which is the most recent wireless spectrum auction, raised an astronomical amount of money because, of course, everything is going wireless. All of our devices and all of landlines are going by the wayside, and now we're all relying on our wireless devices for television and video and for everything else for our daily lives. So the demand for wireless spectrum is huge. And of course, the major players are all well funded and well capitalized. So despite the fact that in the trade press and in the news, a lot of the wireless providers have been ginger about how much they think they'll participate, I think that's just a little bit of game playing with the market, just to keep their competitors wondering. But it's all very clear that, and they've said as much, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile will definitely participate. And Sprint, however, will not, but that's largely because they just don't have the cash at the moment to put on that. And they claim it's because they have sufficient low-band spectrum, but I think that's a PR move more than anything. What's interesting this year also is that the FCC has really made an effort to expand the opportunities for small businesses and for rural providers of wireless. And that will hopefully, the bidding credits that those providers will be able to obtain and use will help them stay competitive and actually get spectrum, in specifically in lower served areas, rural areas where maybe some of the big providers aren't really that interested. But there, of course, are people in rural areas all across the country that need Wi-Fi service, and they need competition as well. So this would hopefully be a really great opportunity for that. I think overall that the money will be there.
You spoke earlier about the effect of or the things we should be concerned about when it comes to multicultural and women-owned media on the broadcast side. What about the wireless side? Or what are some of the issues that have been raised with respect to diversifying ownership of commercial wireless spectrum?
Well, as I was just mentioning, there is a broader push to expand what they call bidding credits for smaller carriers, for competitive carriers, if you will. And those are based on Small Business Administration rules and regulations on how much net income a particular entity can have. Because there are First Amendment issues related to putting aside licenses for specific minority groups or women, the FCC does not do that. But the overall intent of giving these special bidding credit to rural providers and to smaller competitive businesses is intended to increase the likelihood that minority groups and women-run organizations can have a chance to play among the, as they call it, the big boys,
And you also mentioned the AWS-3 spectrum. What is AWS spectrum exactly, and how is it related? How does it play into the incentive auctions?
Not all spectrum is created equal. There's different physics involved and the limitations involved in different bands of spectrum. And we have an engineer in our firm who could explain this to you for hours. But basically, it just comes down to there are certain spectrum bands that are better at carrying different types of data or voice, and the lower band spectrum, such as the AWS-3 and the 700 megahertz band, which was what was auctioned prior to AWS, and then this spectrum that is going to be auctioned, which is called the 600 megahertz band. It's all low band spectrum, which means it penetrates buildings better. And so that for that reason alone, it is tremendously valuable, especially in cities. So you can imagine why a lot of people are very interested in this spectrum.
Davina, it's been great having you on the show, very informative, and I appreciate you coming on. I just have a few final questions, and then we'll close. Sound good?
Sure.
All right. So now you're obviously very successful as a lawyer here in Washington and beyond. What are some of your productivity hacks? They can be apps, they can be tools that you use to stay, or different habits that you use to stay on top of your game.
Oh my goodness. My productivity hacks are having a good staff around me that I can delegate work to, and being willing and able to delegate work. I think that's a huge thing for a lot of people. It's hard to let go and to trust someone else. But the key to being productive truly is you just can't do it all yourself. So you have to have a good team around you to support and communicate with, and make sure that you can serve your clients fully without working 27 hours a day.
And when you were starting out in your career, or any time during your career, what do you think was not to sound negative, but what do you think was the worst piece of career advice you've ever received?
Wow, worst piece of career advice you ever received. Well, I guess I could say a lot of people said, "Why on earth would you want to go to law school?" And it's I asked myself that question at the time, but it ended up being the right choice for me, particularly because I was interested in telecommunications and technology policy work, and I had some great mentors who had been at the FCC and were able to tell me that really to go far in this field, even if you just wanted to do quote unquote policy advocacy work, you do need to have a law degree, because it's a very administrative law and regulatory law intensive field. So that was the right call, but there were a lot of naysayers. I'm glad I didn't listen to them.
Yes, the naysayers. So now, what are you reading these days, Davina? It could be a blog, it could be a particular trade magazine that you enjoy, or maybe not enjoy but have to read, or different books that you've been reading lately that you just feel compelled to recommend to everyone you meet.
Well, I wish I could recommend a book that I've been reading lately, but I have a 2.5-year-old son, and I have a full workload. So a lot of my reading tends to be work related, or like I said, your New York Times and your Washington Post. But I would say to stay on topic, my go-tos are the NAB, which is National Association of Broadcasters, Smart Brief. It's a daily sort of a amalgamation of trade press, not just their own things that are going on, but related to broadcasting. Of course, it has to do with the auction as well. And then for the wireless side, there's also one called the CTIA Smart Brief. Smart Brief is just a platform. And they also send out, basically, it's one email a day, which has links inside and sort of snippets of, big news stories or interesting happenings in that particular realm. So for NAB, they have one, and for CTIA, so you get both broadcast and wireless. And you don't have to sort through 20 emails.
You've been listening to Davina Sashkin, who's a partner at the firm of Fletcher, and Hildreth. Davina, do you have any final words you'd like to leave with the audience?
Well, I would recommend, of course, that any broadcaster or wireless provider who is wondering about their participation or how the incentive auction is going to affect them, they should certainly reach out to counsel. Of course, Fletcher, and Hildreth is available, and we can certainly provide advice and counsel as appropriate. You can find us online at www.fhhlaw.com. I'd also recommend looking at our firm's blog, which is comlawblog.com. The incentive auction, of course, is unprecedented, as I said before. No one's done it before. So we're all sort of learning it together, but it is very complex, and there's a lot of information and a lot of details that are buried in footnotes. So please do find an expert to help you, and we'll be glad to be that expert for you.
Thanks for joining us, Davina.
Thank you so much.
Davina Sashkin. That concludes episode 18 of the podcast. Thanks so much to all of you for listening. I cannot do any of this without you, so thank you. If you're new to the podcast, or even if you've been listening for a while, I have a free cheat sheet for all of my new email subscribers, and you can find the sign up for that at washingtech.com/cheat sheet. And that cheat sheet is a guide for you to get up to speed on various different policy areas, including cybersecurity, intellectual property, and net neutrality. It's a quick reference anytime you're preparing for a meeting or writing something you need citations for. That's washingtech.com/cheat sheet. Thanks again to all of you for listening. I'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.